Close your eyes and let me take you back over 2,000 years to a time when the world was young and unconquered. Tonight, we journey into the life of a man who changed the course of human history before he even reached the age of 33. A king, a warrior, a visionary who dreamed of uniting the entire known world under one banner. This is the story of Alexander the Great, a tale of ambition, courage, conquest, and ultimately, mortality. Let his extraordinary life guide you into peaceful slumber as we explore every chapter of his legendary existence. Our story begins in the ancient kingdom of Macedon, in the year 356 BCE. On a summer night in the month of July, in the capital city of Pella, a child was born who would one day be called the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen. His father was King Philip II of Macedon, a brilliant military strategist who had transformed his small kingdom into a formidable power. His mother was Olympias, a princess from the neighboring region of Epirus, known for her fierce temperament and deep involvement in mystical religious practices. The night Alexander was born, legend says that the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. Ancient writers would later claim that the goddess Artemis was too preoccupied with Alexander's birth to save her own temple. From his earliest days, Alexander was no ordinary child. His mother filled his young mind with stories of his divine ancestry. She claimed descent from Achilles, the greatest warrior of Greek mythology, and she told Alexander that he too carried the blood of heroes in his veins. His father Philip, meanwhile, ensured that Alexander received the finest education available. When Alexander was 13 years old, Philip hired the philosopher Aristotle, one of the greatest minds in human history, to be his personal tutor. For 3 years, in the peaceful gardens of Mieza, Aristotle taught Alexander philosophy, medicine, science, and literature. The young prince developed a deep love for Homer's Iliad, keeping a copy of it under his pillow along with a dagger. He saw himself in Achilles, the warrior who chose a short, glorious life over a long, unremarkable one. But Alexander's education was not limited to books and philosophy. King Philip ensured his son learned the art of war from the finest generals in Macedon. Alexander trained with weapons, learned military tactics, and studied the campaigns of great commanders. He grew strong and fearless, with an intensity in his eyes that made even hardened soldiers take notice. There was something different about this young prince, something that spoke of destiny. When Alexander was just 12 years old, an event occurred that would become famous throughout history. A horse trader brought a magnificent black stallion to Philip's court. The horse was wild and uncontrollable, and none of Philip's men could tame it. Philip ordered the horse taken away, declaring it useless. But young Alexander spoke up, asking his father for a chance to tame the beast. Philip agreed, amused by his son's confidence, and made a wager. If Alexander succeeded, Philip would buy him the horse. If he failed, Alexander would pay for it himself. Alexander had noticed something the others had missed. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. He turned the animal toward the sun, so its shadow fell behind it, then gently mounted and rode it successfully. Philip watched in amazement and reportedly said, "My son, seek out a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedon is too small for you." The horse was named Bucephalus, and it would carry Alexander across half the known world. At 16, Alexander's boyhood ended abruptly. King Philip left him as regent of Macedon while he led a military campaign. During this time, a Thracian tribe rebelled, and Alexander led his first military campaign to crush the uprising. He was victorious, founding a city called Alexandropolis to mark his achievement. 2 years later, at the Battle of Chaeronea, against the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, 18-year-old Alexander commanded the elite cavalry unit called the Companion Cavalry. His decisive charge broke through the sacred band of Thebes, securing victory for Macedon. Philip's dream of uniting Greece under Macedonian leadership was becoming reality, but the relationship between father and son grew complicated. Philip took a new wife, a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, and this threatened Alexander's position as heir. At the wedding feast, Cleopatra's uncle made a toast, hoping for a legitimate heir to the throne, implying that Alexander, whose mother was foreign, was not truly legitimate. Alexander flew into a rage, throwing his cup at the man. Philip drew his sword and lunged at his own son. But being drunk, he stumbled and fell. Alexander mocked him, saying, "Here is the man who is making ready to cross from Europe to Asia, and who cannot even cross from one couch to another without losing his balance." Alexander and Olympias fled Macedon, going into temporary exile before eventually reconciling with Philip. In 336 BCE, when Alexander was just 20 years old, his life changed forever. During a great celebration at the ancient capital of Agay, King Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. The motives remain mysterious even today, but many suspected that Olympias and perhaps even Alexander himself were involved in the conspiracy. Regardless of the truth, Alexander suddenly found himself king of Macedon. He moved swiftly and decisively to secure his throne, eliminating potential rivals and crushing any signs of rebellion. Several Greek city-states saw Philip's death as an opportunity to break free from Macedonian control. They were wrong. When Thebes revolted, the young king marched south with incredible speed. He surrounded the city and offered terms of surrender. When the Thebans refused, Alexander made an example of them that would echo through history. His forces destroyed the city completely, sparing only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, whom Alexander admired. 30,000 Thebans were sold into slavery. The message was clear. Alexander might be young, but he was even more formidable than his father. The other Greek city-states immediately pledged their loyalty. With Greece secured, Alexander turned his attention to the grand vision his father had planned but never achieved: the conquest of Persia. The Persian Empire was the greatest power on earth, stretching from Egypt to India, ruled by King Darius III. For centuries, Greeks and Persians had been enemies. Alexander declared he would avenge the Persian invasion of Greece that had occurred over a century earlier. But in truth, his ambitions went far beyond revenge. He dreamed of conquering the entire known world. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. When his ship reached the Asian shore, Alexander was the first to leap onto the beach. He hurled his spear into the ground and declared that he accepted Asia as a gift from the gods. He immediately traveled to the ruins of Troy, the legendary city of the Iliad, and made sacrifices at the tomb of Achilles, his hero. He was 22 years old, and his legend was about to begin. The first major battle came at the Granicus River. The Persian satraps, or governors, had assembled their forces along the far bank, confident they could stop this young invader. Alexander, ignoring the advice of his cautious generals, ordered an immediate frontal assault across the river. It was a bold, almost reckless decision, but it worked. Alexander himself led the cavalry charge, fighting in the thick of battle. He was nearly killed when two Persian nobles attacked him simultaneously. His helmet was split open, but his companion Clitus saved his life, killing one of the Persians. The Macedonians won a complete victory. Alexander ordered that Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia be sent back to Greece in chains as traitors. But he treated the defeated Persians with honor, beginning a pattern of magnanimity toward conquered peoples that would define his reign. After Granicus, Alexander moved south along the coast of Asia Minor, liberating Greek cities that had been under Persian control. He arrived at Gordium, the ancient capital of Phrygia, where legend spoke of an intricate knot tied to an ancient cart. Prophecy stated that whoever could untie the Gordian knot would rule all of Asia. Many had tried and failed. When Alexander was shown the knot, he studied it briefly, then drew his sword and sliced through it with a single stroke. Whether this story is true or not, it perfectly captured Alexander's approach to problems: direct, decisive, and unconventional. In 333 BCE, at the narrow coastal plain of Issus, Alexander faced King Darius himself. The Persian king had assembled a massive army, perhaps over 100,000 strong, and positioned it between Alexander and his supply lines, hoping to trap the Macedonian army. But Alexander was not intimidated. Despite being greatly outnumbered, he personally led a cavalry charge directly at Darius's position in the center of the Persian line. The shock of seeing Alexander himself, mounted on Bucephalus and driving straight toward him, caused Darius to panic and flee the battlefield. Without their king, the Persian army collapsed. Alexander captured Darius's tent, his family, and his treasure. He treated Darius's mother, wife, and daughters with respect and courtesy, promising them they would not be harmed. Darius's mother, Hydaspes, was so impressed by Alexander that she came to regard him as a son. Rather than immediately pursuing Darius inland, Alexander continued his strategic conquest of the Mediterranean coast. He understood that as long as Persia controlled the sea and the coastal cities, his supply lines would never be secure. City after city opened its gates to him, but one city refused: Tyre. This ancient Phoenician city, built on an island half a mile from shore, believed itself impregnable. Alexander laid siege to it, a siege that would last 7 months and test his determination to its limits. To capture an island city without a navy seemed impossible. Alexander ordered the construction of a causeway from the mainland to the island, a massive engineering project. The Tyrians resisted fiercely, using fire ships to destroy his siege towers and raining arrows and projectiles on his workers. But Alexander was relentless. He assembled a fleet from cities he had already conquered and blockaded Tyre from the sea. Finally, after 7 months, his siege towers reached the walls. His soldiers breached the defenses, and Tyre fell. The cost of resistance had been high. Alexander crucified 2,000 Tyrian warriors and sold 30,000 inhabitants into slavery. It was a harsh reminder that mercy was reserved for those who submitted peacefully. From Tyre, Alexander moved south into Egypt. The Egyptians, who had long resented Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. Alexander made sacrifices to the Egyptian gods and was declared pharaoh. He traveled through the desert to the isolated oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, a journey of incredible difficulty. What transpired at the oracle remains a mystery, but Alexander emerged, claiming that the god Amun had confirmed he was not merely the son of Philip, but the son of Zeus himself. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile. It would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a center of learning and culture for centuries. It was the first of many cities he would establish, spreading Greek culture and civilization across the vast territories he conquered. In 331 BCE, Alexander finally turned his full attention to the heart of the Persian Empire. Alexander's army was smaller, perhaps 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, but it was superbly trained and led by the greatest tactical mind of the ancient world. On the night before the battle, while his generals urged him to launch a night attack to offset Darius's numerical advantage, Alexander refused, saying, "I will not steal victory." He slept peacefully while his anxious commanders waited. The battle began at dawn. Darius's plan was to outflank the Macedonians with his superior numbers, but Alexander anticipated this. He positioned his forces at an angle and held reserves ready. When the Persian cavalry tried to envelop his right flank, he ordered his forces to shift position, creating a gap in the Persian line. At the critical moment, Alexander led his companion cavalry in a wedge formation directly at this gap, driving toward Darius himself. Once again, the sight of Alexander charging toward him caused Darius to flee. The Persian king abandoned his army and ran for his life. Without their king, the Persian forces lost heart, and the battle became a rout. Alexander had won one of the most decisive victories in military history. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the region for over 2 centuries, was his. Babylon opened its gates to Alexander without resistance. The city was incredibly wealthy, and Alexander entered it in triumph, being careful to honor the local gods and customs. From Babylon, he moved to Susa, another great Persian city, where he found the treasury containing unimaginable wealth. Then he marched to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia. At Persepolis, Alexander took possession of the greatest treasure in the ancient world. The accumulated wealth of the Persian kings filled the treasury. Gold, silver, precious stones beyond counting. It took thousands of mules and camels to carry it all away. Several months after his arrival, during a night of heavy drinking, Alexander and his companions set fire to the great palace of Xerxes. Ancient historians debated whether this was a deliberate act of revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens over a century earlier, or a drunken accident that Alexander later regretted. Regardless, the burning of Persepolis symbolically marked the end of the Persian Empire. But Darius was still alive, and Alexander pursued him relentlessly. He led a rapid chase across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. When he finally caught up with the Persian forces, he found Darius murdered by his own nobles, led by Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, who hoped to save himself by eliminating the king. Alexander found Darius dying by the roadside. He covered him with his own cloak and promised to pursue his murderers. He gave Darius a royal funeral, honoring him as a fellow king, and sent the body back to Persepolis for burial. Many of Alexander's generals believed the campaign was over. They had conquered the Persian Empire and gained wealth beyond imagination. Surely it was time to return home to enjoy their victories. But Alexander had other ideas. He declared himself the legitimate successor to Darius, the new great king of Persia, and announced his intention to pursue the traitors who had murdered his predecessor. In truth, his ambitions had grown far beyond merely conquering Persia. He wanted to reach the ends of the earth itself. The pursuit of Bessus took Alexander into Central Asia, into lands that even the Persians had struggled to control. The campaigning was brutal and difficult. The terrain was harsh, the climate extreme, and the local populations fiercely independent. Alexander spent 3 years subduing Bactria and Sogdiana, fighting guerrilla wars in mountains and deserts. He founded cities throughout the region, settling Greek and Macedonian veterans to establish permanent control. Many of these cities bore his name, spreading Alexandrias across the map. During this period, the long years of constant warfare and the changing nature of Alexander's kingship began to create tensions with his Macedonian companions. Alexander had adopted many Persian customs, wearing Persian dress and expecting the traditional Persian gesture of proskynesis, where subjects would prostrate themselves before the king. To the Macedonians, who were used to a king who was first among equals, this seemed like pretentious tyranny. Many grumbled that Alexander was becoming more Persian than Greek. The tension exploded in tragedy. At a banquet in Samarkand, Alexander and his friend Clitus, who had saved his life at Granicus, got into a drunken argument. Clitus accused Alexander of forgetting his Macedonian roots and of dishonoring his father Philip's memory by claiming divine parentage. In a rage, Alexander seized a spear and killed Clitus. The moment he realized what he had done, Alexander was overcome with grief and remorse. He locked himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing food and weeping for his murdered friend. His generals eventually convinced him to emerge, but the incident haunted him for the rest of his life. Another conspiracy arose when some of the royal pages, young nobles in training, plotted to assassinate Alexander. The plot was discovered, and under torture, the conspirators implicated Alexander's former tutor, Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, who had accompanied the expedition as official historian. Callisthenes had publicly opposed the practice of proskynesis and had criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian customs. Whether he was actually involved in the plot or not, Alexander had him arrested. Callisthenes died in custody, either executed or dying from illness, and this created a permanent rift between Alexander and his old teacher Aristotle. In Sogdiana, Alexander met and fell in love with Roxana, the daughter of a local nobleman. Ancient writers described her as the most beautiful woman in Asia after Darius's wife. Alexander married her, a marriage that served both political purposes, cementing an alliance with the local nobility and personal desire. Roxana would become the mother of Alexander's only legitimate son, though that child would be born after Alexander's death. By 327 BCE, Alexander had secured Central Asia and turned his attention to India. Few Greeks knew anything about India beyond legends and travelers' tales. Alexander wanted to reach the eastern edge of the world, which he believed could not be far away. He led his army through the towering peaks of the Hindu Kush, crossing what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. The journey was incredibly difficult, with altitude sickness, cold, and treacherous mountain passes taking their toll. In the Swat Valley, Alexander besieged a mountain fortress called Arnos, which legend said even Heracles had failed to capture. Alexander took this as a personal challenge. Using incredible engineering skill and determination, his forces built a path up the seemingly sheer mountainside and captured the fortress. Every victory seemed to drive Alexander to seek greater challenges. As Alexander entered India proper, he encountered kingdoms and cultures completely foreign to Greek experience. Some local rulers submitted and became his allies. Others resisted. King Porus, who ruled the lands between the Hydaspes and Assassines rivers, raised a large army to stop Alexander's advance. The Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE would be Alexander's last great battle, and perhaps his finest tactical achievement. Porus had positioned his army on the far bank of the swollen Hydaspes River, making a direct crossing impossible. His forces included war elephants, which terrified the Macedonian horses. Alexander devised an elaborate deception. He made obvious preparations to cross at several points, keeping Porus's forces constantly moving to block him. Meanwhile, Alexander took a picked force and marched them upstream during a stormy night, crossing at an unexpected point. When Porus realized what had happened, he led his army to meet Alexander's force, but this left the main crossing point vulnerable. The rest of Alexander's army crossed and attacked Porus from behind. Despite being caught in this tactical trap, Porus fought with incredible courage, refusing to surrender even when wounded. Alexander's respect for the Indian king's bravery was profound. When Porus was finally brought before Alexander and asked how he wished to be treated, he replied, "Like a king." Alexander not only restored Porus to his kingdom, but expanded it, making him a trusted ally. This generosity toward a courageous enemy was characteristic of Alexander at his best. But the Battle of Hydaspes came at a terrible personal cost. During the fighting, Bucephalus, Alexander's beloved horse, who had carried him for nearly 20 years and through countless battles, was killed. Alexander was devastated. He founded a city on the spot called Bucephala in honor of his faithful companion. The death of Bucephalus seemed symbolic. Alexander had reached the farthest point of his conquests, but he was beginning to lose the things most precious to him. Alexander wanted to continue eastward. He had heard of the wealthy kingdoms of the Ganges River Valley and wanted to add them to his empire. But his army had reached its limit. They had been marching and fighting for 8 years since leaving Macedon. They had crossed deserts and mountains, fought in climates from the frozen peaks of Central Asia to the humid heat of India. They were thousands of miles from home, and they wanted to go back. At the Hydaspes River, the army refused to go further. Alexander raged and pleaded. He shut himself in his tent for 3 days, hoping his soldiers would change their minds. They did not. For the first time in his life, Alexander could not get his way. Finally, he gave in to their demands. He set up 12 enormous altars on the banks of the Hydaspes to mark the eastern limit of his campaign, and the army turned back. It was a crushing blow to Alexander's dreams of reaching the ends of the earth. The return journey was a disaster in many ways. Alexander decided to march his army through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Why he chose this route remains debated. Some say he wanted to surpass previous conquerors who had failed to cross it. Others suggest it was the most direct route to coordinate with his fleet. Whatever the reason, the desert crossing was catastrophic. Heat, lack of water, and shifting sands took a terrible toll. Flash floods destroyed supplies. Thousands died. It was the worst loss Alexander's army ever suffered, worse than any battle. When they finally emerged from the desert, Alexander's forces were devastated. The years of constant warfare were also taking their toll on Alexander personally. He drank heavily, and his temper had become more volatile. In 324 BCE, at Opis, near Babylon, a mutiny broke out when Alexander announced plans to discharge his oldest veterans and integrate Persian soldiers into the Macedonian units. The veterans felt insulted and betrayed. Alexander had several of the ringleaders executed, then locked himself away. After 3 days of tense standoff, the soldiers broke down and begged forgiveness. Alexander reconciled with them, holding a great feast where he prayed for harmony between Persians and Macedonians. It seemed like a triumph of reconciliation, but the underlying tensions remained. Later that year, Alexander's closest friend, Hephaestion, died suddenly, possibly from typhoid fever. Alexander was devastated beyond measure. Hephaestion had been his companion since childhood, his most trusted general, perhaps his lover. Alexander's grief was overwhelming. He ordered a period of mourning throughout the empire. He had Hephaestion's doctor executed for failing to save him. He built an enormous funeral pyre and ordered the construction of a massive monument. Some said Alexander's grief drove him temporarily mad. He threw himself into planning new campaigns, as if constant action could numb the pain. Alexander began preparations for an Arabian campaign. He wanted to circumnavigate Africa and conquer Arabia. He had ships built and supplies gathered. But in the spring of 323 BCE, Alexander fell ill. He had been at a party hosted by his friend Medius of Larissa, drinking heavily as was his custom. Over the following days, he developed a fever that steadily worsened. For 12 days, Alexander fought the fever, sometimes seeming to improve, then relapsing. He was only 32 years old, seemingly in the prime of life, yet his body was failing him. On the 10th day of his illness, Alexander lost his ability to speak. His generals and soldiers filed past his bed, and though he could not talk, he recognized each man, greeting them with his eyes. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Alexander the Great died. The cause of death remains one of history's great mysteries. Was it malaria? Typhoid fever? Poisoning by enemies or rivals? Natural illness? The effects of years of wounds and drinking? We will never know for certain. When his generals asked him on his deathbed to whom he left his empire, Alexander reportedly whispered, "To the strongest." It was an answer that doomed his empire to civil war. Without a clear heir, his generals, known as the Diadochi or successors, would spend the next 4 decades fighting among themselves, eventually dividing Alexander's empire into several kingdoms. Alexander's body was placed in a golden sarcophagus filled with honey and transported in a magnificent funeral cart. But the cart never reached Macedon, where Alexander had supposedly wished to be buried. Ptolemy, one of his generals who had seized control of Egypt, diverted the funeral procession to Egypt. Alexander's body was eventually placed in Alexandria, the city he had founded, where it remained on display for centuries, visited by Julius Caesar, Augustus, and other famous figures, before eventually being lost to history. Roxana was pregnant when Alexander died. She gave birth to a son, Alexander IV, who was declared king along with Alexander's mentally disabled half-brother, Philip Aristeas. Both would be murdered within a few years as the successor wars raged. Alexander's line died out, but his legacy lived on in ways he could never have imagined. In just 13 years of reign and 11 years of active campaigning, Alexander had conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to India, from Egypt to Central Asia. He had never lost a battle. He had founded over 20 cities, most named Alexandria, spreading Greek culture throughout the ancient world. His conquests created the Hellenistic Age, a 300-year period when Greek culture, language, and ideas spread across the Near East and beyond. Mixing with local cultures to create something entirely new. Alexander's impact on history cannot be overstated. He changed the political map of the ancient world permanently. He opened up trade routes between East and West. He spread Greek language and culture so effectively that Greek became the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East for centuries. The New Testament would be written in Greek because of Alexander's conquests. Buddhism would spread to the west, and Greek artistic styles would influence Indian art. Cities he founded would become great centers of learning and commerce. But perhaps his greatest legacy was the idea itself, the dream of uniting diverse peoples under one rule, of breaking down the barriers between cultures, of achieving the impossible through courage and vision. He proved that one person with enough determination could change the world. His life inspired countless others, from Roman generals to medieval kings to Napoleon Bonaparte, all of whom studied his campaigns and tried to emulate his achievements. Yet Alexander's story is also a cautionary tale about the price of ambition. He achieved everything he set out to do and more, but he died young, far from home, having sacrificed his friendships, his peace of mind, and ultimately his life in pursuit of glory. He never saw his sun. He never grew old. He burned bright and fast, like a meteor across the sky of history. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about this young man who set out from a small kingdom in northern Greece and carved his name so deeply into history that we still speak it with awe over 2,000 years later. Think about the soldiers who followed him to the ends of the earth, the cities he built, the cultures he joined, the impossible obstacles he overcame. Alexander the Great lived more in 32 years than most people could in several lifetimes. His story reminds us that greatness is possible, that destiny awaits those bold enough to seize it, but also that even the mightiest conquerors are still mortal, still human, still subject to the same frailties and failures as the rest of us. Rest now and dream of ancient empires, of charging cavalry and burning cities, of mountain passes and desert crossings, of a time when one man's vision reshaped the world. Sleep well and let the legend of Alexander guide you to peaceful dreams.